Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 30th edition of the Alexei Sayle Podcast. I'm abroad at the moment, which is why I'm using the built-in microphone on my computer, so it might not sound as perfect as it usually does. I'm also recording this on a momentous day when Liz Truss has just resigned a few minutes ago, but also the first episode of Alexei Sayle's Imaginary Sandwich Bar Season 4 goes out this evening, and it's a fucking nuisance that she's resigned because there are a couple of...
Oh, do you talk about her?
Yeah, there's a couple of references, yeah, and I don't know what we're going to... Not in this episode, actually, luckily. But we may either Vigi is going to have to make a statement saying this show was recorded several weeks ago, or we're going to have to try and do an edit, really.
Oh, shit.
But it's me who suffers. It's me who suffers most from Liz Truss's.
Well, she'll still technically be Prime Minister for the next 7 days, right?
Yeah, so it's not.
This episode and next episode, she'll still be the Prime Minister.
Yeah. I'll speak to Joe, my producer, see what we can do. It's a shame, really, because we had one brilliant laugh about her, and I don't see that we can keep it in now. But anyway, we will see. But first of all, I would like to... We have got this... This episode is an interview mostly with Richard Sanders, who produced and part directed the Al Jazeera series, The Labour Files, which is all about...
The second episode.
He directed the second. I think he produced the whole series, but he directed the second episode, which is all about what we love most, which is internal shenanigans within the Labour Party and the right wing's perfidy in all its various forms. So I'll let the program, I'll let the show talk about that. I wanted to amplify slightly on an idea I raised in the Sugarfoot podcast about this idea about. Well, to recap, really, I've several things. I've always had this idea that one of the things I've always admired about Alcoholics Anonymous is that it has no policies about anything, and also that it's the people who are appointed to leadership roles, they don't really have any power, and they're changed. But I could never see a way that you could apply that to conventional politics. But now I've come up with this idea about. I think what I'm going to do is call it. Vote for Nobody. That's my part. This is the party I'm proposing, called Vote for Nobody. It's based on the idea that the largest party in any election is say there's a 65%, 70% turnout, and then the winning party gets 30% or 35% of that turnout. But nevertheless, the largest constituency, actually my maths might be slightly shonky here, but the largest constituency is actually people who don't vote. So what I'm going to try and I'm proposing is that we activate the non-voting constituency. We say so. The logo, I think, is a black outline of a person, neither male nor female, in an entire bodysuit, and we propose. And that's the logo. It's just this black.
Can it be
outline.
like a dotted outline to kind of?
No. I think it should just be like a person in a black bodysuit, basically, but just a black.
Okay.
And we say to people, vote for nobody. That rather than wasting your vote by not voting, use it to send a real protest by voting for nobody. So we vote for nobody. At the moment, we have no policies. You can vote for us if you're right wing. You can vote for us if you're left wing. It just means that you're disillusioned with the political system. And it might be, I think, that nobody might take their seat in the House of Commons and just sit there in their black bodysuit all day saying nothing. Which
anyway. The idea is that you put a random object in their seat.
Yeah, I've changed that.
Oh,
it's nobody. No, nobody sits there now.
Okay.
If we win,
will you just leave the seat empty?
Well, no, or nobody. The person in the black bodysuit sits in that seat.
Oh, everyone has to wear one of those suits.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, all right.
If we won, yeah, they'd turn up on their first day in their black bodysuit and just sit there.
Yeah.
All day, every day.
Okay, because there needs to be a visual aspect to, because what I liked about the random objects is that on the broadcast of the Commons meetings, you'll see like a lampshade or a kitchen tray.
I don't think you get away with that really.
But actually, you have to actually show up as a person. But there's no rules on what you can wear, right? Yeah, so
not as far as I know. No.
The bodysuit that also covers your head and face.
Yeah.
And you just like a silhouette of a person. Okay, lovely.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's the idea. I'm just putting that out there. I'm going to work on it. This is what I feel. I've not filled in all the gaps yet, but this is what I feel. This is what my entire life has been leading towards.
But now it comes to the point where, we come to the problem where, like, encouraging people who don't vote to actually go out and vote, but vote for this party. Because there have been, like, protest parties that you could vote for, Monster Raving Loony or Count Boys or whatever. But people still don't show up to vote for them. So
no. You'd have to go. Our activists would have to go out into the community, into the non-voting community, and urge them to vote. Tell them, say, look, this is a really subversive thing you could do. Maybe lay on minibuses. If our crowdfunding goes well, lay on minibuses to take people to the polls, and just point out to them that this is a way. The reason they don't vote is because they feel disenfranchised.
Yeah.
And they feel, I suppose, that if you vote, a politician gets in, which is true. Some ambitious, deceitful person, by and large, will get in. But this, if you use your vote to not vote, as it were, then, nobody will get in. And it won't be an ambitious, deceitful politician. It will be your protest. And through that outreach, you could see people engaged in politics, They may then, we might run soup, we might run soup kitchens on the side or gardening.
That's great. Listeners at home, let us know what you think about Vote Nobody. In the emails, alexeisaylepodcast@gmail.com, or tweet us at alexeisaylepod. Instagram is the same. Message us on Patreon. Donate to our Patreon, patreon.com/alexeisaylepodcast. And something else we talked about on the last episode was cowboys. And often while we record interviews, I'll be like Googling things that you talk about that I'm not familiar with. And during this coming up interview with Richard Sanders, which was recorded with proper microphones, by the way. Sorry about the sound quality of the intro, but yeah. During this interview with Richard, you mentioned John Ware, who made the panorama of anti-Semitism in Labour. And I wanted to quickly just remind myself what his face looked like. And I Googled him, and it was what the top result I got was actually a legendary black cowboy from Canada called John Ware, who was one of the first black people ever in Calgary, and is quite a legendary individual. And he had, he could like stop a charging cow head on and wrestle it to the ground. He was a master horseman. He was born a slave, and then when slavery was abolished in America, he went up and helped herd thousands of cows up to Canada and became one of the first cowboys in Canada. And I thought it was a bit of serendipity that John Ware and cowboys came together.
He didn't direct the panorama. Is Labour anti-Semitic, though?
He certainly didn't, no.
But I wish he had. No, but that's, they...
Oh. You completely broke up there, your signal. But I think that's the fates telling us maybe to get on with the interview. What do you think?
All right. So anyway, ladies and gentlemen, Alexei Sayle, a younger Alexei Sayle, a pre-Liz Truss chaos departure Alexei Sayle, and Richard Sanders. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the podcast with Richard Sanders, who directed one episode and was executive producer of the other two episodes.
Well, not executive producer. I made the second in the 3-part series,
the Labour Files for Al Jazeera, which all the left, our entire demographic, is absolutely crazy about.
Yeah, them and no one else.
Yeah, but I think we can talk about, we first met when you got in touch with me because you were, and this is where we have to be, we're going to talk about the Panorama documentary, Is Labour Anti-Semitic?, directed by and produced by John Ware.
John Ware was the reporter. Yeah.
Was the reporter.
Yeah.
John Ware is extremely litigious. I think I can say he looks like a prick without him, with that glasses halfway down the nose fucking look, and the kind of, he looks like a raddled old kind of 50s cinema idol. And also, you can clearly see that this man thinks he is fucking all that. I mean, this is a man who loves himself to a great degree. Anyway, but we have to be careful about
what we say about him.
We say about him. Nevertheless, I don't think that bit is actionable, saying somebody looks like a prick. But we met when you originally wanted to, when it first came out, you were appalled at the nature of it, I think we can say. And you initially wanted to make a thing with the wrong kind of Jews, which was basically boiled down to me, Miriam Margolis, and Michael Rose.
Well, that's right. It was a quite brilliant idea I had, if I might say so myself. I mean, it wasn't particularly in response to the Panorama, although it was about that time you and I met, wasn't it? It was certainly pre-COVID. And the idea at that time was to have a 3-headed program, yourself, Miriam Margolis, and Michael Rosen, just presenting an alternative perspective and on the Labour anti-Semitism crisis and general musings on your own Jewishness and how you related to your Jewishness, etc., which I still think would have been a wonderful film, but I couldn't get anyone else interested in it. So.
No. Well, that's, I mean, one of the things I think we see in the Al Jazeera films is the totality, the one-sided nature of the smear campaign against Corbyn, that you could say Corbyn was an anti-Semite, or the Labour Party was institutional anti-Semite, with no blowback whatsoever. To say the truth, which is that Corbyn wasn't an anti-Semite and the Labour Party was not infested with anti-Semitism, came at a great risk, I think, didn't it?
Yeah, my own motivation was various. Really, I'm not a Corbynite, but I did feel that a lot of the coverage at that time, particularly around the anti-Semitism issue, was just very obviously very bad journalism. And to a degree, I felt there was a sort of market opening in actually properly reporting all this stuff. So although I never got that original documentary made, Peter Oborn and myself have written various things, some in Open Democracy, more for Middle East Eye. No one else seemed to be interested in it. But there was an interesting opening, just doing proper journalism on this stuff, particularly in the wake of when the leaked report came out and then the EHRC report came out. Just a lot of the journalism around this was just really dreadful journalism.
Yeah, I think that's one. First of all, I have to say, I should put in an encomium for the BBC in my own experience, that the BBC's been nothing but fantastic for me, and also Radio 4 have been amazingly supportive. So I have to put that in to hang on to my... because it's true, so the BBC is not... I know we're not exclusively talking about the BBC, but it's not a monolithic organisation, but there is nevertheless a tremendous problem with their reporting of, the whole anti-Semitism, in inverted commas, crisis, and with the rest of the press, really. It seems to me that we have gone through well, I don't know, I suppose you talk about it. We seem to have gone through some kind of mirror, into an alternative universe, really, where suddenly proper, responsible, judicious diligent reporting went out the window, and they can't really get it back, really. I don't know how you mean.
That's right. I think, there were a lot of powerful vested interests that had it in for Jeremy Corbyn and really wanted to undermine Jeremy Corbyn. And they all alighted eventually on the anti-Semitism thing as the perfect weapon. And it is the perfect weapon. Firstly, who wants to be on the wrong side of the anti-Semitism debate? The history of anti-Semitism and the experience of Jewish people in Europe and so on is just so horrific that it's a charge that obviously has enormous potency. And I think as well, I think it's important to be fair here. It had enormous potency because I think most of the people, most of the time, who were most invested in it genuinely believed it. My experience of people who might be called liberal Zionists is that they genuinely do believe that people who are firmly anti-Zionist are at the very least suspect.
Really?
Yeah, no, I think there were certain people at certain times who were probably being pretty cynical. But I think a lot of the people, a lot of the time, genuinely believe it. They find it hard. Even people who themselves may be quite critical of certain aspects of the behavior of the Israeli state, find it very hard to relate to a fundamental critique of Zionism in any way other than that it in some way reflects people's attitude more broadly to Jews. And I think they're quite sincere in that.
Really? Even though, to make the obvious point, a lot of those people who are voicing those criticisms are themselves Jewish, aren't they?
Yes, I mean that was one of the... And I think that's possibly why those pro-Corbyn Jews find themselves the subject of the most ferocious criticism, because it does rather undermine things, and they have to be portrayed as a sort of lunatic fringe, which was very unfair for people like Naomi Wimborne-Idrissi and Jenny Manson, who are, elderly Jewish ladies. In no way are they sort of loony left. And Professor Avi Schleim and Jeffrey Beinman.
Avi Schleim served in the Israeli army, for instance.
And Jeffrey Beinman, it's ludicrous to portray these people as some sort of lunatic fringe. And they're just people Jews who are not Zionists. Or Jews who, Jeffrey Beinman would probably certainly say that he's not anti-Zionist, but certainly Jews who are not pro-Zionist.
Yeah, and like you say, I think that goes some way to explain the ferocious attack within the Labour Party and outside the Labour Party on those anti-Zionist Jews, because it undercuts the whole rationale of that.
And you have that ludicrous statistic which Jenny Manson articulates in our film, that their own calculation is that Jews are 6.3 times more likely to be investigated for anti-Semitism by the Labour Party than non-Jews, which really ought to set an enormous alarm bell ringing. It doesn't, apparently.
It's extraordinary. The extent to which, if you can describe a kind of nullity as being massive, the massive way in which those programs have been ignored is, in its own way, telling, isn't it? Don't you think?
It is. I think why this is, there's various reasons. I think we were very unlucky in that we'd aimed to coincide with the Labour Party conference, and then the Conservative government imploded in this astonishing and bizarre way. The Labour Party conference, in its own terms, became a sort of triumphal procession. The whiff of 97 is in the air, and so on. And no one really wanted, we weren't sort of tapping into the zeitgeist at all. No one really wanted to rake over the coals of the Corbyn years and so on. And so in part, I get that. And, in part, I don't think it is necessarily a conspiracy of sons. What I do find extraordinary is the panorama. Now, with John Ware's panorama, we're making 4 very concrete allegations. It's not some sort of scattergun, it's a horrible right-wing program or something. It's 4 very specific allegations. And I think anyone watching it would think, A, they're quite serious allegations of, apparent inaccuracy, and B, they seem to be pretty well evidenced. Now, if the BBC is able to turn around and say to me, no, you've got it wrong for this, and this reason, I'll hold my hands up, and that's fine. But I think for the BBC simply not to engage, to simply put out a blanket, we stand by our journalism, and then just to keep quiet, and no one talks about it, seems to me entirely unacceptable in the national broadcaster.
And it's also that given that John Ware is so eager to resort to the courts, if your allegations weren't true, you'd think he'd unleash Mark Lewis of Patreon Law, would be round your house in a second, really. And the fact that they haven't lashed out in that way, and leashed their dogs of lawfare, kind of implies that that their only tactic really is to ignore your accusations.
Yes, I mean, I don't know. Maybe you should get John Ware on and ask him. in the past, when Peter and I have written about this, and when Novara Media have written about this, he has written enormously lengthy replies. I mean, people who want to see John Ware's point of view can look at that. We in Open Democracy printed the entirety of his response. He, I think, in the Jewish Chronicle, wrote an enormously lengthy response to a Novara Media piece. So, John Ware's views are out there if you want to go and look at them. My personal feeling is they don't provide sufficient explanation for the apparent inaccuracies we're presenting. There is, of course, a legal case looming, Paddy French, at the beginning of November. It's possible John Ware feels he needs to remain quiet ahead of that. I don't know. So all I can observe is that the BBC and John Ware are determinedly saying nothing, and as a result, no one else is saying anything. I mean, it was interesting. The only people really to fire back at my program was Stella Creasy and her partner Dan Fox, who were immediately deluged beneath a torrent of people saying, "Well, hang on, the evidence in the film speaks for itself." So their experience perhaps shows the wisdom of other people's not saying anything. I mean, I take it as a compliment to the journalism at the moment that people clearly don't feel able or don't feel that they want to engage in public debate. The strategy appears to be stand still and don't blink, and maybe they'll go away. Right. And the depressing thing is I'm very grateful to be here, and I'm very grateful to be on Palestine Deep Dive. But I mean,
you have to be on the morning, the one show.
I'd love to be on the Today program.
Graham Norton. Yeah, where you should be, really.
But it's not happening at the moment.
No, and that does. I mean, maybe we should. In greater detail, let's go into. Well, I don't know. Go into your history, I suppose. To be fair, to what led you to this point.
I think, in general,
this career-ending point.
I think. Well, as I say, in part, it was a sort of market opening. No one else was going to report this properly, so I thought I might as well. Has
that been a good move?
Well, we'll find out.
Yeah.
I mean, I've always had. I've been working as a TV producer for 25 years, and I've always gone straight from one film to another. And here I am, having finished that one, sitting here. So we'll see. Maybe I'll never work again. I hope that's not the case. We'll see. But there were partly I'm always drawn to what's difficult, and this is an immensely difficult subject on one level. It's one people seem to find it emotionally and intellectually very difficult. I did feel that the journalism was appalling, but also I had a very strong sense. Rada Karmi, the Palestinian writer, asked me this the first time I met her. Why do you care? And I think the truth is, it seemed to me very obvious that if you are continuously appropriating to yourself the right to say, they may talk about Israel and Zionism, but they mean Jews. Now, if you are unquestioned appropriating that right to yourself, where does that leave Palestinians? Yeah. If every time they articulate their struggle, they're told, you might say that, but you mean something else. And it seemed to me the entire narrative very obviously, served to shield what all of the world's human rights organizations agree is an apartheid state. It very clearly served to provide a shield from criticism. It also clearly undermined and disempowered Palestinians, and in fact, more than that, demonized Palestinians. The minute you inflict the taint of anti-Semitism on people, which has such dreadful resonance in European history, you've undermined them in a very fundamental way, and certainly opened the door to demonization and dehumanization. And that's what I felt. It was the impact on Palestinians of all this that really motivated me.
And I mean, I always think there is a broader kind of agenda as well, because anybody who is a socialist will be by and large, will be pro-Palestinian, and therefore it not only subverts, the Palestinian cause, but also it's been used to subvert the entire course of socialism, hasn't it? Really,
Yes, I mean, I cared less about that. The Labour Party is its own business. I mean, it seemed to me the fundamental undermining of an entire people was something that sort of exercised me more emotionally. But I think you're absolutely right. And I think going forward, this is something the left has to confront. because this is, it's been battle tested now. And it is the perfect way. Anyone going forward is likely to be a champion. Anyone genuinely radical is likely to be a champion of Palestinian human rights and a critic, not just of Israel, but, of the broader concept of Zionism. Mm-hmm. And they can now always be destroyed using this. And the left has to think quite carefully about how it addresses this in future. I mean, I'd point you towards something that you can get it online, the hustings, the leadership hustings of the Jewish labor movement, chaired by Robert Peston in January 2020, where Peston presents the argument that the very act of arguing for a free speech caveat by Corbyn in September 2018, when the Labour Party adopted the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, the very act of suggesting you needed a caveat to protect free speech, he argues that in itself is anti-Semitic and should have led to what he calls a reckoning at that time. And he gets really quite worked up about it. It's you should watch it. It's very revealing. Yeah. And at one point, Rebecca Long Bailey just attempts to say, well, I can't exactly remember the wording. And she is howled down by the audience. Now, it shows the corner that the left had allowed itself to be backed into by that time. And I think it ought to be required viewing for anyone who cares about Palestinian human rights, because they had allowed themselves to be backed into a corner where they simply couldn't open their mouths at all. Yes. And I think Huda Amouri, the young Palestinian woman's comments on those minutes of the meeting between Steve Reed and the Board of Deputies and the and other Jewish communal groups, it comes at the end of our film. And I think Huda is very articulate about this. She points out that it shows the immediate eliding of the fight against anti-Semitism with combating the policy of BDS. Mm-hmm. Yes. And it shows, she says it's quite shocking to see the two things so cruelly and obviously wedded together. Mm.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that we've talked about this a bit on the podcast, that the left, Jeremy Corbyn made a terrible mistake in not fighting back against these accusations much earlier. And I think, again, I always sort of blame McDonnell. I think there was an element that thought if we make one more apology, if we just apologize, that this will draw a line under it. Of course, not understanding that these people are board of deputies, etc., the Jewish labour movement are bullies who will never accept an apology.
I mean, what I think people will often say to you is, why didn't he state it, his opposition to anti-Semitism, his condemnation of anti-Semitism clearly and firmly, which is why at the beginning of the film we have, I think it's about a 3-minute section where he just does it again and again and again and again. I think my own view is that Corbyn was confronted with two issues that I'm not sure any Labour leader could have dealt with. One was Brexit, where he has the conundrum of a party where 80% of people remain and 70% of the constituencies had voted to leave. I'm not sure if any Labour leader could have squared that circle. No. And the anti-Semitism thing, and I've talked to various people actually in the last few days about this, and I think this is certainly a debate that needs to happen within the left. But it seems to me there are one of two things you can do. You can either stand up and say, well, no, sorry, it's an apartheid state, and therefore from an anti-racist perspective, I'm going to condemn it, and I'm going to very firmly condemn it. And if you are going to attack me from an anti-racist perspective, your evidence needs to be really good. Yeah. And I'm not going to be knocked off course here. Yeah. That's one position to take. If you're not going to do that, you probably have to go all the way to the other extreme and do what Starmer did and make your speech in front of the Labour Friends of Israel and basically accept their agenda. Yeah, okay? But then it needs to be one or the other. Yeah. And it seems to me that, Jeremy, if you're not going to do one or the other of them, you're endlessly twisting in the wind in between. Now, there are people I've spoken with in the last few days who disagree with that and think there was a middle course you could take. I'm not sure what that middle course was.
I don't think there was a middle course. I agree with you. I mean, I think that it's one or the other. Well, and if you care about anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, human rights,
I think the first
you take
course,
option one.
But option one, I suspect, Jeremy and people around him were right in calculating, is simply impossible to articulate in the British sort of media climate. You simply, standing up and saying I'm sorry, it's a racist ethno-state whose defining feature is that it's structured to ensure the domination of one ethnicity over another. I just don't think you're allowed to do that. And I'll probably get in trouble because I've just done it.
Yeah.
You're simply not allowed to do that in Britain, even though that is the position of all the world's leading human rights organizations, including Bet Salem, which is Israeli.
Absolutely, yeah. It's, I mean, in a way, I suppose it's, I know when you're in the middle of something the way Germany was, when you being attacked from so many sides, it's very hard to think straight, I think. I mean, as a pro-Palestinian activist, I have noticed the idea of the new anti-Semitism starting around about 2000 when they started sort of beta testing it, trying it out, didn't quite work, getting pushed back, coming back again and again until it grew, the IHRA definition and all that shit, until, it finally it blossomed.
It gets turbocharged after 2016 because it's the perfect weapon to attack Corbyn. Now, I think the Israel lobby is very powerful. It simply is, but it ain't that powerful. And the reason it gets turbocharged after 2016 is because all sorts of other groups also have a vested interest in destroying Jeremy Corbyn. And various groups who don't give a damn about. There's elements on the Labour right, for example, who I don't think give a damn about Israel or anti-Semitism for that matter. But they worked out they had the perfect weapon here, and it was a weapon that disempowered poor old Jeremy, because there is a man whose entire life had been about anti-racism, and it sort of disarmed him. I just don't think it just left him floundering.
Yeah, I think it must have been on a personal level. It must have been terribly confusing, really.
I think he found it very difficult personally.
Yeah. I mean, I always think that 50 years of campaigning against anti-racism compared to giving back into a mural that might or might not have had some dodgy stuff in it. So you take 40 years, an entire life spent saving anti-racism or tweeting support for a mural. It's
which he hadn't looked at properly.
The extraordinary imbalance. Maybe then, we could go on to the other, leaving behind that the whole anti-Semitism smear and just go on to the other stuff within the Labour Party, I suppose. Those series of films reveal I suppose it's the degree to which elements within the Labour Party hierarchy conspired against the democratically elected leader of the Labour Party.
That's right. Film 1 is about general skullduggery by the Labour right against the left, particularly in Liverpool. Film 3 is about racism. And the hierarchy of racism. And of course, while we were making this series, the Ford Report came out, which, even if you don't want to listen to Al Jazeera, read the Ford Report.
Yeah.
Now, the Ford Report is couched in very cautious language, and it does a bit of both sidesism and blah, blah, blah. It in large measure vindicates a lot of what we're saying in the series, particularly if you read it carefully and read it properly. It's a fascinating and rather surprising.
Yeah, I was all expecting that it would be a complete whitewash, and while there are things I disagree in it, it is a long way from a whitewash.
You get towards the end of it, and you look at the stuff about anti-Semitism training, where he starts calling for a broader approach and for Jewish Voice for Labour. For it not just to be left to the Jewish Labour movement, but for Jewish Voice for Labour, which supported Corbyn, to be involved in that anti-Semitism training. It's pretty radical what he's suggesting, and which you can see from the pushback.
Yeah, the Jewish Chronicle went nuts about that,
which is interesting because everyone else just kept quiet about it. The Labour right just kept quiet about that Ford Report, as they have about our series, because they thought, well, if we keep quiet, no one will know that's what he's written. And again, that was the sensible approach. I thought it was rather unwise of the Jewish Chronicle and other people to really push back, because I don't think anyone would have noticed those bits at the end of the report if they hadn't jumped up and down and said this is entirely unacceptable. And of course, John Ware's response to our programme was to say, I disagree with the Ford Report.
Even though that was commissioned by Starmer is meticulously researched.
Yeah, it took and didn't see the light of day for 2.5 years. I'm journalistically, I'm still beavering away here. I'd love to know the inside story of why the Ford Report didn't come out for 2 years, and the four Ford panelists are being very professional and tight-lipped. And but I'd love to know what
you can guess, can't you? Which is to stake this. If it had come out when it was completed, it would have had much more power than it does now.
Yes, I mean, they managed to, as it was released on the hottest day in history, and all sorts of other things were going on. It's got pretty much ignored, but it's an interesting read, the Ford report.
Yeah.
You sort of sense that Martin Ford got it. He understood what, and to a large, what he was commissioned to look at the leaked report, which was the Labour Party's own study during the Corbyn era into anti-Semitism, which is also a fascinating report. And for any proper historians or journalists out there, if you really want to understand the Labour anti-Semitism crisis, read the leaked report, because although it doesn't question some of the fundamentals, as a portrait of the internal workings of a party, it's without precedent. I mean, in fact, I think it rather took by surprise in the closing days of Corbyn's leadership, the people it was presented to, Jenny Formby and Carrie Murphy. I don't think they'd expected someone to carry out such an incredibly detailed, obsessively detailed study. I mean, it's a remarkable document, the leaked.
And Labour's the Labour Party under Starmer, their response was rather than examining the examples of incredible racism and from Emily Oldknow and Ian McNick, the former leaders of the people who are being paid to support Jeremy Corbyn, rather than examining that they have legally attacked the people they think leaked it.
Well, there's two things they do. One is they commission the Ford report to look into the leaked report, which then doesn't report for 2.5 years. And then when it reports, it's buried as well. But the other thing is, so the Labour Party is being pursued by two groups for the revelations, for data protection violations. Okay. It's having to spend enormous amounts of money defending itself. And it's taken out what's called a Section 20, where it seeks to recover its costs from the people it claims, although it doesn't seem to have any evidence of this, it claims leaked the report, who also coincidentally are the people who wrote the report. Right. Okay. Yes. And, they're three young people who the Labour Party is effectively seeking to destroy their lives, to bankrupt them. And certainly one of them has no money whatsoever, and it's very hard not to feel that they are being punished for having written the report.
For those of our listeners not embedded in Labour shenanigans, can you just, Talal asks, what was the leaked report?
Yeah, I mean, you have to become an expert in the endless reports here.
And I have become, and it's ruined my life.
Let me walk you through them. First of all, you get the Equalities and Human... Hang on, EHRC. The Equalities and Human Rights Commission, the Statutory Equalities and Human Rights Commission, which is the successor to the Commission for Racial Equality, which used to deal with race. They then threw in all sorts of other inequalities, gay rights and women's rights, and blobbed them all together in this single organisation. They, in the spring of 2019, announced they were going to investigate the Labour Party for anti-Semitism. And is extraordinarily intrusive in what it's demanding from the party. Wants all sorts of information. I know at one time is demanding people's private emails and so on, which, given the outrage about the supposed data violations of the later leaked report, is interesting. I mean, they wanted access to records that the party pointed out it had no access to. It can't get people's private emails, their private WhatsApp chats, and so on. Anyway, in preparation for this, the party itself starts producing its own sort of submission. And it's handed to these young, extremely efficient young party staffers who start to do it quite obsessively. And in doing so, for the first time, really start to uncover what appears to have been, according to the leaked report, the ineffectiveness of the party bureaucracy prior to April 2018 in tackling anti-Semitism and other things. For your listeners, it's a really simple, fundamental point to understand, which no one in the media in Britain ever points out. Until April 2018, Jeremy Corbyn has no control over the bureaucracy of the Labour Party. And it is the bureaucracy of the Labour Party, specifically the disputes department within the governance and legal unit, which is responsible for investigating anti-Semitism complaints. And Jeremy Corbyn has no control over this. In fact, the Labour bureaucracy is controlled by the right, by precisely the people who will then be his most ferocious critics. And you can see quite clearly that what happens is the moment he brings in Jenny Formby to be General Secretary, what actually happens is, far from using that power to cover up anti-Semitism or whatever, suspensions, notices of investigation, expulsions all go through the roof, which rather contradicts the narrative of the media. Anyway, it's only in preparing their submission to the EHRC that the party really becomes fully aware of what was going wrong prior to 2018. Right. Now, they produced this 861-page report, which in the dying days of the Corbyn leadership is suddenly presented to the leadership. And firstly, they're slightly panicked because it contains all these WhatsApp conversations. I mean, it really is extremely... It's critical of the Corbyn period as well. It's critical of the Jenny Formby period. It's not a whitewash by any means. Yeah. But it's ferociously critical of the regime under Ian McNicol, which had run the party previously. And some of the evidence is so explosive that, I think the people... Even the people running Corbyn's headquarters are rather alarmed by it. Even more alarmed are the party lawyers. There's a very interesting thing happens here. Well, to the enormous frustration of the young people who write the leaked report, the lawyers say, we can't hand this to the EHRC. We can't publish this. And they're like, why not? Here it is, laid bare for the first time. And they say, look, they are judging the Labour Party. What this report does is prove that the Labour Party was indeed inept in dealing with anti-Semitism. They're not judging one specific aspect, they're judging the party as a whole. We can't possibly release that. Right. This. Now, therefore, it's not submitted to the EHRC. Very shortly afterwards, it's leaked in its entirety, unredacted, which is a mistake because it means all sorts of people's names are in the public domain, which shouldn't be, And the party concludes that the people who've leaked it are the people who've written it. Now, they don't have any evidence of this. Or
by this time, the party is Starmer rather than...
Party is Starmer, although the decision not to publish it and not to send it to the HRC happens in, virtually the last week of Corbyn's time in charge. That's not a decision by Starmer.
Yeah, that's the subsequent hounding of the authors.
Of the authors and their line managers, Seamus Milne and Carrie Murphy. Yeah. It happens under Starmer, yes. And it, as I say, it's very hard to conclude that behaviour. It feels vindictive, and it feel. I'm not presenting this as a hard fact, but it feels as if these young people, very vulnerable young people, are being punished for having written the report at all.
Yes, I mean, in a way, I suppose sometimes you might think, well, this is just the shenanigans, machinations of an organisation, and it could, the Labour Party is an organisation in the same sense that, a fishing club or a football club or any organisation has a degree of internal conflict. But I think this set of shenanigans is so much more important, isn't it? I think it tells us something profound about how skewed our entire society is.
Yes, I think it's interesting because the right of the Labour Party, of course, have every right to disagree with the left of the Labour Party. Factionalism happens within all parties. It has every right to organise against the left of the party, every right to seek power for itself within the party. I think what particularly our film One was exposing is behaviour that goes rather beyond factionalism. What it appears to show is that frequently within the party, the reaction to the extraordinary events of 2015 and 2016, when you get an absolute takeoff in the membership of the Labour Party, it's an extraordinary thing. People forget now, a massive increase in membership. It becomes the largest political party in Western Europe, over 500,000 members. Now, you would think a political party would be quite pleased about this, quite excited. What is extraordinary is that the sort of visceral reaction of the Labour Party, and this is partly what we glean from the internal files, but also you can see it publicly. There's a sort of almost visceral revulsion towards these members. You can see it in the WhatsApp chats. They're like, who are these people? You know, and when they assume that it's going to be electoral disaster, I mean, let's be fair to them, that their principal objection is that they take the view, and this was a very understandable view in 2015 and 16, that this was a kamikaze act of self-harm. Now, what's interesting is that as the 2017 election progresses, and in fact, the Labour Party starts to soar in the polls, and these enormous crowds start to turn out, they're saying to each other in these WhatsApp groups, who the hell are these people? You know, what's going on? Who are these people? There's no delight in the fact that they're being proved wrong.
No.
And when the Labour Party the extraordinary portrait you get in the leaked report of the events of election night, where the leadership within Party HQ are sort of ashen face. You know, they're appalled. And one of them, I think, writes in one of the WhatsApp groups precisely the opposite of what I have been working for the last 2 years. I mean, it's extraordinarily
an employee of the Labour Party being upset that the Labour Party has had tremendous success.
You know, you don't have to rely on me, Al Jazeera, or the leaked report, or the Ford report for this. Gabriel Pogrund and Patrick Maguire's book Left Out, you know, a couple of Murdoch journalists, or Murdoch-employed journalists, is very, very good, actually. It's well worth reading.
Yes, I've read every book about this shit I've read.
Yeah, and it's but they have an extraordinary story of Ian McNicol, the General Secretary, coming into work, I think it's the next morning, and the door closes and somebody has this smash, and he's drop-kicked a vase across the room. That's his reaction to the Labour Party.
To the Labour Party having tremendous success.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So they seem to feel this sort of, you know, some of them anyway, at local and national level, seem to feel this almost visceral revulsion. Now, in programme 1 of the series, you know, we particularly look at 2 places, Brighton and Wallasey. And I think they're very interesting sequences where what happens is, and I'll be careful the way I put it here, but it would appear to be the case that the local right-wingers, or the local incumbents, the people who have power and have office in the local Labour Party, respond to the enormous upsurge of new members, generally from the left, generally pro-Corbyn, by issuing a series of statements about their behaviour which appear to be untrue, all right, and which subsequent evidence certainly suggests to be untrue. I mean, in Liverpool, you have this wonderful story where there's a dispute going on internally. People are campaigning against each other. And you always get the same thing. People are accused of accessing the Labour Party's data in order to campaign, okay? And you shouldn't have access to the data and what have you. The evidence for this is this fella is supposedly spotted going around this close in Liverpool, Wallasey, and he only puts leaflets through the doors of the Labour members. This would indicate that he has access, illegal access. And there are 4 witnesses to this, all right? Now, to this fella's enormous delight, they've picked on a weekend when he's in London.
Yeah.
And he can prove it. He's got the train fare. And so, you know, it's clearly not true. And then you have 4 witnesses who've all sworn to the fact that they saw him. Yes. So it's clearly not true. Now, he presents this evidence with great delight to Labour Party headquarters. And the only reaction is one senior official says, good job we didn't expel him.
Yeah.
And they do, in any case, expel him shortly afterwards anyway.
Yeah.
So what you have is a situation where there's a remarkably little interest in engaging all these new members in debate. I mean, you know, just because all these people have joined, you don't simply hand the party over to them. That's fair enough.
Yeah.
But the reaction seems to be to simply utilize the right's control of the party machinery to bring disciplinary measures against them and have them expelled. And they Labour HQ appears to
on
be
trumped
prepared.
Up charges. Yeah.
Well, charges that often appear
to be trumped up.
But Party HQ appears to just simply go along with this, and there's very often very little scrutiny. So, you know, Liverpool, Wallasey, and Brighton, the notorious spitting incident in Brighton, which appears not to take place. And Peter, gets very angry about, Peter Oborne gets very angry about this in the series, and I think he's right. What happens is that it's the most disgraceful demonization of perfectly decent
really
Labour Party.
Thoroughly decent people.
For example, in Liverpool, Wallasey, they're being accused of homophobia, okay?
Yeah.
And they're being accused of I mean, it's sort of 1970s Larry Grayson stuff of making limp wrist gestures and so on. And then you go and you meet these people, which of course journalists never did. No. And they're perfectly decent, responsible, mature trade unionists very often who have, gay or bisexual children. And it's quite ludicrous. And what I found particularly mortifying was the readiness of the sort of London-based media to just swallow any.
Well, you've got Tessa Jowell, who had many skeletons in her own closet, being allowed to make these accusations, and then people she's accusing are given no right of reply whatsoever.
And the media had no interest in going and talking to them. I mean, you see this in my film as well, where we go and talk to Rika Bird and Helen Marks in Liverpool Riverside.
Yeah,
Liverpool Riverside again, a constituency Labour Party, Louise Ellman, who had been, I think it's the chair of the Labour Friends of Israel, something like that anyway.
She was my mum's MP.
Yeah, and so, you'll be familiar with this. Yeah. Liverpool Riverside was portrayed as the sort of dark heart of the Labour anti-Semitism scandal. Louise Ellman was very vocal about the appalling abuse she'd received. So you actually do journalism and go there and travel to the dark heart, and you meet the two women involved in the story that is in the Panorama film about that constituency. Yeah. And what do you find? You find two little old Jewish ladies who didn't say what they're said to have said and have a tape recording to prove it.
Yeah. And yet that they were completely ignored.
Yeah. And as I say, I've said this before, Joshua Funnell uncovered that tape recording a week after the Panorama went to air and published it in the Canary. I've written about it before in Middle East Eye. No one gave a damn, No. Well, no one still gives a damn, it would seem, but it's got a little bit more prominence. But it was the readiness of the national media to simply swallow any nonsense about the Labour rank and file. And it was disgraceful. It was sort of metropolitan snobbery, and really, the absolute slandering and defaming of people whose only crime was to engage in the political process. And there was a guy in Brighton, I think, who says, my first mistake was to join the Labour Party. My second mistake was to win an election with the Labour Party. Yeah. And all hell broke loose about their heads. It was disgraceful.
Yeah, unbelievable. What now do you think, really, I suppose, is the...
Well, I think... I'm a journalist, and what I care about is journalism. And I think journalists, there really ought to be a reckoning. It was a very interesting thing. Mick Lynch, who is a very able media performer. I'm not sure he's the genius he's made out to be. But, when you and I were kids, working class blokes, trade union leaders, and they normally were blokes, you'd see them on telly all the time. Articulate working class socialists were not some sort of freak novelty in media. And I think both our political and media class have become much narrower and more middle class and more sort of metropolitan than they used to be. And I think it's very, Mick Lynch sort of falls like a pebble on a still pond, doesn't he?
But it's also the fact that he just says, and it's a lesson for Corbyn as well. He just said he constantly says, no, that's a lie. No, that's not true. No, you're making that up. Yeah. No, that didn't happen. In a way that I think the left.
And I think there's openings. As I say, I treat the whole thing as a market opening in a way. And the Vara media attempts to do what it does. But I think there are a lot of young people that the whole Corbyn thing has now simply been relegated to history as if it was some sort of bizarre, freakish, extremist aberration. If you're our generation, okay, your political outlook is shaped by the elections. I'm slightly younger than you, Alexei. Our political outlook is shaped entirely by two elections, 83 and 97. And I have to admit, I bought into this. Those two elections appeared to show that regardless of whatever you believed, the further left you moved, the fewer votes you got. The further right you moved towards the centre, triangulation, the more votes you got. When Corbyn was elected as leader, I thought, well, I rather like him and I rather agree with a lot of what he says, but this seems absolutely daft. They're just clearly relegating themselves to electoral irrelevance. Then you had the extraordinary phenomenon of the 2017 election, okay, which just blew this out of the water.
Yes.
And I was amazed by the degree to which my colleagues in mainstream media and people of my generation simply just carried on as before, as if this hadn't happened.
Yes.
And now when you look at sort of analysis of modern British history and the strategy that Labour Party needs to pursue and so on, the media simply writes the 2017 election out of the equation.
Completely, as if it never happened. Yeah.
And the 2019 election, the Labour Party got a higher share of the vote than it had in 2010 and 2015.
Yeah.
Even then, and won by quite a margin amongst people under 50. So I think in time, I think this simple ignoring of the perspective of a huge chunk of the British population isn't tenable. And I'd hope it would, create openings for younger journalists coming through to challenge the sort of stranglehold of the sort of Guardian commentariat has on mainstream, or what would regard itself as liberal left journalism. And I think there is an enormous opening, because I think there's
at the moment, that's what I always say, is that we're not right all the time, socialists, but there's like, I don't know, 4 or 5 million people that anti, you take the 2 million people that went on the Iraq march and then march and then double it or whatever, who believe in, nationalisation, anti-colonialism, pro-Palestine, all that stuff, who are completely locked out the parliamentary process at the moment. And that can't, I find it pleasing that you think that can't go on forever.
I don't think it can go on forever because that group is so big. I mean, the Labour right always related to Momentum and the Corbynite upsurge as if they were dealing with Militant and the Socialist Workers' Party and with various sort of Trotskyite sects of the 80s. They never grasped that they were dealing with a mass movement. They were dealing with something very different.
Yeah.
And I don't, and also different from 83. There's a huge age differential here. As I say, in 2009, even in 2019, Corbyn won by a lot among people under 50.
Yeah.
And by a hell of a lot amongst people under 40.
Yeah. And
I think that it's bubbling away and it will come to the fore again. At the moment, the left is in complete disarray. I think it's on one level, it's a shame that the implosion of the government is so extraordinary that I think the Labour Party may well win by a considerable, it might well be that it'll win by a considerable majority, and that will mean all sorts of problems can be swept under the carpet.
Because, one of the things that they're doing very consciously is making sure that only right-wingers get to stand as MPs now.
Yes, the Parliamentary Labour Party was pretty right-wing to start with.
Yeah, and getting worse. Yeah. And obviously the attack on Sam Tarry and on, and the other... the deselection of there's, all the deselection contests at the moment in the Labour Party are all against left-wing MPs, aren't they?
Yeah.
Not that Sam Tarry is actually that bleeding left-wing.
No. I think that'll gather pace. I think, looking at in broad terms, the thing that would break the hold of these two parties on the British system would be PR. And you do feel more and more the desperate need for PR just to loosen up and free up the British political system. And if this was supposed to be coming in 97, and of course Blair then forgot all about it because he didn't need it because he'd won by so much. And I have a nasty feeling the same might happen this time.
Yes.
Although I find it hard to imagine Starmer winning the same sort of majority Blair did.
Yes, or being or serving more than one term if he does, really, because he's such a dickhead.
Well, you might say that. Yes, Blair, whatever one thinks of Blair, was very, very good at being Tony Blair, whereas Starmer, who appears to have decided that his job is to be Tony Blair, isn't very good at being Tony Blair.
He's not very good at anything, really, I think. Well, that's a remarkably upbeat conclusion, I think, to end this podcast.
It is, isn't it? I thought of that I might be upbeat about something. Yeah. I think you can't, you can't beat people down forever. And I think also our series, people seem to be determined not to listen to it. And I would urge anyone listening to please share as widely as you can the films, because it's like a sort of subterranean book. It's only going to be spread by word of mouth.
Yeah.
We're clearly not going to get any.
Sammy's that.
There's maybe going to be no amplification from the mainstream.
But it is sort of slowly seeping out there, and the odd sort of, kind of like George Monbiot going, I didn't know about
Michael
this.
Crick as well.
Yeah, Michael Crick. Yeah,
and
again.
Peter Hitchens, bless him.
Yeah.
And I think also this attitude, particularly by the BBC, that if we just keep very quiet, no one will notice it ever happened. And the Observer haven't written about it, so we're all right. It is very old-fashioned. The clip involving Ben Westman and Rika Bird in Liverpool Riverside has been shared 1 million times on social media.
Yes.
And you can't really...
This is this man terrified by these two elderly... It brought to tears by these two elderly Jewish ladies who didn't say what he said. They said.
That's right. Poor old Rika Bird has, of course, since been expelled anyway.
Yeah. And as their daughter, Jo, of course.
Yeah. Yeah.
Talal says a lot of idiots sort of go on about the ownership of Al Jazeera. Is it worth addressing that? Or I don't know.
Because I've never quite got the lines straight.
Yeah.
I mean, all I would say in response to that is, if I forever, for a moment, came under any sort of editorial pressure to curb my journalism by the owners, then I wouldn't have worked on the project. I mean,
yeah.
And obviously, if I was making a film about conditions at World Cup stadiums, I wouldn't make it for Al Jazeera.
No.
But in this instance, there's no editorial interference at all, and it's a subject clearly they were the only ones prepared to.
Yeah, fair enough, I think. Well, there you go. Upbeat conclusion. Yes. Onwards, comrades.
All right,
thank you, Richard.
Thank you for having me.
It's been an absolute pleasure. It's, brilliant. Hello, everybody. We thought that was the end of the podcast, but we've decided to come back. It's 2 weeks later. We've had 11 different Chancellors of the Exchequer, and there's been more developments in the John Ware and Panorama case. So Richard has come back and tell us what's going on now, Richard.
So when I was with you before, I made the point that John Ware and the BBC appeared to be responding to the allegations against us by simply pretending they didn't happen, by essentially saying we stand by our journalism and that was it, not to respond to the specific allegations. Now, almost immediately we'd done that interview, John Ware produced online a 6,500-word article where he very definitely did decide to respond to the allegations. But it's an extraordinary read. It can be found online. He wrote it for a thing called The Article. So read it. Your listeners can find it online and read it and make their own minds up. But essentially, there are 4 very concrete allegations in the film. The article by John Ware deals with half, or really less than half, of one of them.
And unconvincingly, but yeah.
Well, we'll come to his arguments about it. I mean, it's an enormously detailed piece. But he's the sequences in the film that I think most people have found most striking. The sequence about Ben Westerman and Rika Bird up in Liverpool, where the recorded evidence would certainly suggest his account of their meeting was inaccurate. The Izzy Lenger story, where she claimed she was told Hitler was right. Hitler didn't go far enough in the Labour Party every day. Various extraordinary things. What he's focused on is our story about Seamus Milne's email. Now, the main point of that story was that we felt it had been unfairly edited. The context had been removed, that Milne was referring very specifically to a Jewish party member and referring very specifically to those situations where Jews were being accused. And the Panorama program simply missed out that context. Now, for us, that was the principal point of that sequence, and John Ware doesn't address that at all. What he does address is something which is really just a single sentence in the film, which is to say that, in fact, Seamus Milne was responding to a request for information from party headquarters, from the disputes, from the person who oversaw the disputes team. So, in our telling, that would undermine the argument that the leadership was interfering. Now, it's very interesting what he does here, actually. I mean, although it's a terribly specific point he's homed in on, it's actually very interesting to home in on that point and to really pick apart what happens there. And I'll whiz through it very, very fast. I won't take 6,500 words. I promise we won't. Well, very, very briefly, what happens is that this website called Palestine Live is exposed by a dossier. Okay, and this is out there in the press as containing anti-Semitic statements and rhetoric and so on. James Schneider in the leader's office reads this and is horrified by it. He feels some of it is genuinely anti-Semitic, and rings up the disputes team at party headquarters to say, well, what are we doing about this? To find that they're not doing anything at all about it. Anyway, at that point, they do start doing something about it. So yes, on one level, the initiative initially here does come from the leader's office, but I think you come back to this again and again and again, and it's a thing that has been totally absent in the reporting, that when you do home in and focus on instances where the leader's office do appear to have intervened, invariably they're intervening to speed things up and make them tougher. Now, the EHRC report, which of course damned Corbyn, if you actually read it carefully, and you have to read it very carefully, it acknowledges this. Yes. And it takes the extraordinary argument that the aim of the intervention is irrelevant. Simply by intervening, they are undermining the process, and therefore that's anti-Semitic. So in other words, if Corbyn responds to the immense pressure on him to do something, to get a grip by doing something and getting a grip,
yes,
that in itself is anti-Semitic. I mean, it's absolutely absurd logic. Yeah. But that's the EHRC's
But that's
logic.
the kind of example of the fucking bullshit through the fucking Black Mirror world that, this is.
Yeah. And actually, if listeners do want to sort of really home in on the thing that John Ware is writing about, it is indeed slightly complex, that one, who contacts who first and who's responding to who. John Ware is right. It's not straightforwardly that Ware responds out of the blue. That he's correct in that. But when you Milne, not Ware, that's right. Milne is not responding out of the blue. He is. There's already an ongoing conversation, but. And what actually happens, because it's quite a revealing story, and this can all be read in the leaked report, the famous leaked report, which is available online. If it doesn't take much looking, you can find it online, and is the absolute Bible if you actually want to understand what happened here. It's an extraordinary document, in large measure, not entirely, but in large measure now vindicated by the subsequent Ford report. Yeah. So what actually happens, and it's quite a good story. So Schneider, and I'm taking my account here from the leaked report, which is incredibly detailed and backed up by footnotes. Possibly other participants in this event might have different accounts, but whatever. So Schneider says, well, what are you doing? And they effectively, of course, it turns out they're doing nothing. So they start to do something. They come up with 3 names, okay, and they suspend 3 people. 2 of them are party members who have absolutely nothing to do with the Palestine Live website, but simply happen to share the same name as 2 people who do have something to do with the Palestine. Yeah. And the third one is this Jewish member, the son of a Holocaust survivor, who hasn't actually written anything at all. He's a member of the chat room, but he hasn't actually written anything at all. And so what Schneider is saying is, why are you going for this Jewish bloke when, for example, and he identifies somebody else who is a straight-up Holocaust denier, who they're entirely ignoring. Yeah. And that starts a whole backwards and forwards, whereby the suspension of the Jewish guy is eventually lifted because Matthews, who runs the disputes team, himself acknowledges it's a very weak case. Yeah. Anyway, so it's this is all an incredible amount of detail. As I say, people, if they want, can read the leaked report.
I think our listeners do seem to, there's a section of our listeners anyway that love this, and it's not, in a sense, it's not arcane, is it? Because this is reading these reports and stuff, this is about a fundamental kind of destruction of democracy in a way, a fundamental ruining of the one chance of a different political viewpoint that was, that opposed neoliberalism. And so it's not, on one level, it's, thousands of documents, but it's really important shit.
It is very important. And really, regardless of what one thinks of Jeremy Corbyn, and I'm not a huge admirer of Jeremy Corbyn, probably less than yourself, but the media doesn't have the right to simply destroy the leader of the opposition because it doesn't like him. Yeah. He had the right to expect basically honest and fair journalism, if not from the Telegraph and the Mail and so on, at least from the BBC, ITN and the Guardian, and he didn't get it.
No, I agree. And that's fucking amazing. important. Should we end there, or do you want to take John Word part a bit more?
I think I'll leave it there.
All right, leave it there. As they used to say as Jeremy Clarkson used to say on the old Top Gear, on that bombshell, we'll leave it there. Thank you for listening, subscribing, contribute to our Patreon, and enjoy this podcast, and see you next time. Bye-bye. You've been listening to the Alexei Sayle Podcast. This show is produced and edited by Talal Karkouti. Music by Tarbush Records. Thanks to Anthony Overton for the sound mixing, and to Audio Boom for hosting us. Please keep your emails coming in at alexeisaylepodcast@gmail.com. Goodbye.